Milk, cheese, and yogurt at Walmart and Costco aren't just staples in American households, they're turning into a luxury. Families who once grabbed a gallon of milk without thinking now face shelves with skyrocketing prices and questionable quality. Behind the glossy packaging, dairy products show cracks, supply chain breakdowns, hidden additives, and a U.S. dairy crisis that experts warn could get worse. Imagine paying double for butter, sour cream, or ice cream, only to question if it's even safe. This isn't just about inflation, it's about health, survival, and what's really left inside U.S. dairy. Part 1. Price Shock, the 7 dairy staples and the receipt. The shock did not start in the dairy case. It began when meat prices punched holes in weekly budgets and households slipped toward milk, cheddar, and yogurt as the so-called cheap proteins. Sandwiches could stretch the month. Smoothies could cover breakfast. A carton here and a block there kept the peace. Even so, Plan B only works until the math flips, and today it has. Plan B just broke. Meanwhile, milk sits at the center of that flip because a gallon that hovered near $2.50 in 2023 now presses $5 to $6 in 2025, and does it without apology. School cafeterias change menus, neighbors split warehouse packs, and parents start counting ounces. But the most surprising thing is how quickly a habit becomes a calculation when a staple doubles. When milk doubles, habits crack. As a consequence of this, we have to count the levers that move the gallon, and there are 4. Tariffs on Canadian imports rearranged supply. Feed costs for cows surged 35 to 40% as soy and corn wobbled under trade tension with China. California's drought strained the nation's largest dairy engine. Labor shortages in the Midwest left milking shifts uncovered. 4 levers, 1 gallon. By the way, you'll never know what's really hidden in your plate at chains like these. Subscribe now and protect yourself before your next bite. On the other hand, cheddar tells the same story with sharper edges because a simple $3.99 block in 2023 now circles $7.50 to $8 and drags lunchbox math behind it. Families slice thinner. Restaurants fold less into melts. The comfort of the classic grilled cheese turns into a ration. What many did not see coming is how quickly school lunches felt the cut. Sandwich math collapses. Even so, the map behind cheddar matters, since Mexico and China fired back with retaliatory tariffs that choked exports. Canadian cheddar stepped into lanes the United States once owned, and energy for refrigeration doubled its share of the bill. Cold costs do not blink when margins get tight. As a consequence of this, the export map silently raised local tags by inches and then miles. Export maps raised prices. Meanwhile, butter took the hit next, an ingredient that is memory, as much as fat, because $3.50 a pound became $7 to $7.50, and holiday baking lost its breath. The pie you always bring risks becoming a text that says, "Not this year." Bakeries fold the increase into croissants you can feel at the register. Childhood tastes turn into occasional events. Holiday baking on hold. However, the cost stack under butter is layered like pastry. EU competitors pushed harder as U.S. exports slipped. Fertilizer and feed spikes squeezed farms. Diesel logged record miles into every pound. A hard border with Canada slowed butterfat flows. Each thin sheet of cost added weight until the dough would not rise without more dollars. As a consequence of this, every layer told the same story. Costs stack like layers. On the other hand, yogurt and ice cream were supposed to be the small joys that survived any storm. A 90-cent cup drifted toward $1.80 or $2, and a $4.50 tub slid to $9 and beyond, with some brands trimming ounces while keeping the sticker strong. Kids open lunch bags to fewer flavors. Parents slide dessert to someday. Even so, the aisle still hums with bright colors and softer claims. Snacks turn luxuries. Meanwhile, powdered milk and infant formula pulled the harshest spotlight, since $18 a can became $35 to $40, and the echoes of past shortages rattled new parents awake at night. Plant closures after safety recalls shrank output. Additive tariffs from China tangled the ingredients list. Aluminum for cans turned dear. What many did not see coming is how fast fear returns once shelves look thin. The nursery feels it first. However, even the small ritual of coffee met the squeeze, because cream and half that lived near $2.20 a pint now ask $4.50 to $5. Cafes bake surcharges into the menu. Home brewers stare at the fridge and pour black. Declining herds from bankruptcies, energy-heavy processing, and trucking shortages multiplied into one quiet morning loss. As a consequence of this, the day starts with a tax. Even coffee gets taxed. On the other hand, the 7 staples move together like links in a single chain, rising 30 to 100% between 2023 and 2025 across Walmart, Costco, and every store that thought it could hide in the middle. This is not random drift. Tariffs pressed from the border in. Feed costs climb from the field up. Drought cut from the sky down. Labor, energy, packaging, and recalls squeezed from all sides at once. Follow the pipeline next. Even so, numbers do not comfort a parent who is explaining why the cart is lighter, which is why we will trace each cost from barn to fridge and name where it lands. The current flows through duties, diesel, drought, and downtime until it empties into the total you can't unsee. The chain is long, but the cause is close. As a consequence of this understanding becomes the first tool that pays you back. Your receipt knows the route. Part 2. The cost stack. From barn to fridge, every link pays. However, a tariff isn't just a number on a customs form, it's a multiplier that echoes through freight, storage, margins, and finally your fridge. A 10% duty on a pallet of milk powder becomes 12 to 15% by the time diesel, warehousing, and retail markups are stacked on top. Meanwhile, wholesalers cannot absorb perpetual losses without cutting lines or raising bids, so the surcharge walks straight to the shelf tag. Policy lands in pantries. Even so, feed is the quiet giant driving the loudest price because a dairy cow eats mostly corn and soy every single day. Between late 2023 and mid-2025, benchmark feed costs rose roughly 35 to 40% amid trade frictions with China and weather shocks in the Midwest. As a consequence of this, every gallon reflects a ration bill that no accountant can wish away, even when demand slips. Feed costs feed prices. On the other hand, climate acts like a second ledger, charging interest on heat and drought before milk ever leaves the parlor. California, the largest U.S. dairy state, logged repeated drought alerts through 2024 to 2025, reducing forage yields and stressing herds, which depresses output per cow. Meanwhile, evaporated reservoirs force pricier water and trucking for feed. Weather writes receipts. However, cows don't milk themselves and trucks don't drive alone, and labor shortages hit both ends at once. Immigration bottlenecks left dairies across the upper Midwest short on workers during peak cycles, while a national driver gap collided with record diesel averages above $4. As a consequence of this, pickups at creameries slid, routes stretched, and products sat longer than it should. No drivers, no dairy. Even so, getting milk cold and keeping it cold has become one of the fastest rising bills in the chain. Refrigeration and deep freeze power draw a bigger slice of operating costs as utilities raised rates and heat waves pushed peak surcharges. Meanwhile, distribution centers that blinked at overnight power spikes paid penalties that boomeranged into the price per pint. Cold costs climb fastest. On the other hand, the container itself joined the bill because packaging rides the oil and metal markets whether we like it or not. Plastic tubs and lids track petrochemical prices, and aluminum for infant formula cans and evaporated milk jumped with global smelter constraints. As a consequence of this, the vessel that holds your yogurt or formula now taxes the product inside it. The container got expensive. However, safety failures don't just bruise reputations. They erase inventory for months. After high-profile formula recalls and plant closures, domestic output slid, while inspections tightened, and ramping back up required validated cleanroom processes that cannot be rushed. Meanwhile, one shuttered line rippled into bare shelves across multiple states. One closure, months of pain. Even so, the export map circled back to your block of cheddar because retaliation abroad can pinch supply at home. When Mexico and China levied counter tariffs on U.S. cheese, shipments rerouted, processors throttled production runs, and domestic inventory tightened while fixed costs stayed put. As a consequence of this, less surplus meant less promo fuel in your local case. Blocked abroad, pricier here. On the other hand, retailers under pressure played every familiar card they had. Promotions thinned, family size quietly shrank, and private label dairy expanded into spaces national brands vacated. Meanwhile, you noticed the same price beside a smaller tub, and the weekly digital coupon stopped appearing. Deals quietly disappear. However, the Aldi callback stings here because the bargain halo hides trade-offs when inputs spike. Private label lines can hold a lower tag by trimming ounces, reformulating fat content, or widening sourcing specs that once were tighter. As a consequence of this, the cheapest cart can become the most misleading line by line. Cheap can cost more. Even so, fast food confirmed the drift at scale, echoing our McDonald's episode where value menus shrank while prices held. Chains across the country cut the thickness of cheese slices, dropped second slices from builds, or swapped to processed blends to survive dairy spikes. Meanwhile, the combo looks the same until the bite feels thinner. Value menus lose value. On the other hand, all these inputs converge beyond the drive-thru in the dairy case, because the next shock lands where margins are paper-thin: schools, bakeries, and cafes. District food budgets stretch milk service across fewer days. Pastry cases shrink to fit butter costs, and lattes quietly add a dairy surcharge. As a consequence of this, the system's strain becomes personal at breakfast. Households react next. Part 3. Backfire in real time: kitchens, classrooms, and counters. However, the breaking point didn't arrive with a bang. It crept in on receipts, where milk at 5 to 6, butter north of 7, and cheddar flirting with 8 turned a weekly routine into a budget drill. The curve that looked theoretical in January bent hard by summer as every dairy staple moved in lockstep. Meanwhile, families who once skimmed the circulars for comfort deals now stare at totals that feel like warnings. The increase is no longer noise, it's narrative. The curve finally bites. Even so, you can hear the story clearest in kitchens where rituals snap first, because a gallon that used to disappear without notice now gets measured like medicine. Parents pour smaller glasses, freeze half gallons, and save the last inch for recipes that need it most. On the other hand, powdered or UHT cartons, once reserved for storms, suddenly become weekday stand-ins for cereal and baking. The fridge light shows fewer white jugs. Fridge rituals rewritten. Without subscribing, the next time you sit down at a chain restaurant, you'll have no idea what risks are riding on that fork. Subscribe today, or keep eating in the dark. Meanwhile, lunch and dinner shift from favorites to math, as grilled cheese loses a slice, and taco night trades sour cream for salsa to keep the tally steady. Yogurt cups that padded school bags turn into weekend-only treats, and ice cream waits in the back of the freezer for birthdays instead of Tuesday. As a consequence of this, joy becomes a scheduled event instead of a ready comfort. The menu smiles less often. Joy becomes a calculation. However, classrooms carry the pressure publicly because school nutrition directors must balance ledgers with hungry bellies, and dairy lines that once felt automatic begin to rotate or thin. Per-meal budgets stretch across more students with less room for milk service staples, and carton waste audits turn into survival math. On the other hand, districts call suppliers for relief and meet the same silence families here. Bell schedules can't feed budgets. Budgets fail the bell. Even so, bakers and cafes become the town barometers, raising prices a quarter at a time while pastries shrink, and lattes earn a cream surcharge that no sign can hide. A croissant loses layers you can taste. A cheesecake moves to weekends only, and a foam art heart costs 50 cents more because half and half costs dollars more. Meanwhile, regulars trade daily stops for Saturday visits. Morning comfort costs more. On the other hand, the bill doesn't settle at the register. It settles in bodies because reduced milk, cheese, and yogurt intake means less calcium and protein, while cheaper fillers glide into dinners. Households that cut dairy drift toward refined calories to keep plates full, and the savings on paper turn into future costs, no receipt records. As a consequence of this, health becomes the hidden line item: savings tax health. However, the pain wears different accents by region, and geography writes the surcharge in local ink. California's drought tightens shelves across the West, the upper Midwest fights chronic labor gaps on dairies, and the Northeast pays for heat and cold through utilities that bite both seasons. Meanwhile, Southern cafes juggle cream prices while tourist towns shave desserts to keep menus approachable. Different states, same squeeze. Even so, trust erodes fastest where words no longer match ounces because family size contracts quietly and half-gallon packaging invites a second glance at the fine print. What many did not see coming was how a familiar brand could keep the price while teaching shoppers new math with smaller tubs and thinner slices. On the other hand, unit price stickers become the only truth tellers in fluorescent light. Words hide less milk. Meanwhile, the internet turns scattered moments into a movement, with viral side-by-sides of 2023 versus 2025 containers, close-ups of smaller scoops, and receipts that look like rent stubs. Hashtags thread individual shocks into a banner phrase that won't go away. Dairy Backfire. As a consequence of this, store managers brief teams before the phones come out, and still the images land. Screenshots become protest. However, retailers are not statues. They lobby and negotiate, asking for targeted tariff exclusions, expedited inspections on low-risk dairy lanes, and short-term credits on feed or cold chain energy to stabilize shelves. Policymakers counter with the need to protect domestic producers and rebuild resilience the hard way. On the other hand, each hearing sounds different from a checkout beep. The standoff hardens quietly. Who blinks first? Even so, the political storyline simplifies what the cart already knows, because a shield against volatility became a boomerang hitting consumers first. Duties and retaliation rerouted product abroad, costs climbed at home, and availability thinned until protection felt like punishment. Meanwhile, slogans meet the math, and the math wins. The headline writes itself, "Shield turned boomerang." As a consequence of this, outrage needs a partner called method. And the exit ramp is practical, not poetic. Proven buying tactics, smart swaps that keep nutrition, co-op leverage, and demanding proof from brands build competence faster than waiting for a miracle in the dairy case. On the other hand, the playbook only works if it lives on your fridge door and not just in your head. The next part makes it actionable. Competence beats chaos. Part 4. From Panic to Playbook. How to buy dairy without bleeding cash. However, outrage won't refill a jug or stretch a stick of butter. A plan will, and the plan has to work, while 7 staples move like a single storm. Milk, cheddar, butter, yogurt, ice cream, formula, and cream are all pulling the receipt upward together, so survival becomes method, not miracles. Meanwhile, the goal isn't to quit dairy, it's to control it so the kitchen controls the budget. As a consequence of this, you need a lane you can drive every week. Pick your lane today. Even so, the first fixes are almost invisible because portioning and timing do more than coupons ever could. Pour 4 to 6 ounces of milk per serving and stage refills. Buy midweek when markdowns hit and split a warehouse gallon with a neighbor so nothing spoils. On the other hand, freeze butter and hard cheeses in labeled portions the day you buy them, so you thaw only what you use and never pay for waste. Small moves, big savings. Meanwhile, swaps that protect nutrition without surrendering flavor keep spirits steady. Use shelf-stable UHT milk for sauces, soups, and baking to save fresh jugs for drinking, and fold reconstituted powdered milk into pancakes and bread dough where it vanishes. Even so, block cheese beats slices on unit price and melt quality, and a sharper aged cheddar lets you grate less while tasting more. As a consequence of this, the plate still feels generous. Swap, don't surrender. On the other hand, technique multiplies value, turning the same ingredients into longer weeks. Make yogurt at home by heating milk, cooling to warm, adding a spoon of live culture yogurt, and keeping it cozy for hours until it sets. Save the whey for soups or bread. However, whip softened butter with a touch of neutral oil and a pinch of salt to create a lighter spread that lasts. And stretch cheese with bechamel, so casseroles taste rich on half the shreds. Technique multiplies value. Even so, where you shop can be as powerful as what you buy. Warehouse clubs win on gallons, cream, and 2-pound blocks when you split or freeze, while ethnic markets often underprice yogurt, paneer, and ghee because they move volume fast. On the other hand, local dairies and weekend pickups sometimes beat chain prices on refillable jugs. And many grocers drop dairy markdowns in late morning and early evening if you know the rhythm. Root beats receipt. Meanwhile, the label is your compass, and reading it like an auditor protects your cart. Start with unit price per ounce, then scan fat percentage and protein to avoid paying more for diluted formulas. Even so, watch wording. Natural cheese isn't the same as cheese product, and family size can shrink quietly while keeping the tag. On the other hand, check date and lot codes for rotation, and note country of origin on cheese to compare lanes. Read the fine print. However, promises without proof are just packaging, so ask for evidence the way we learned in the Aldi breakdown. Email brands for a one-page 2025 recall and audit summary, and keep replies in a folder by product name. Ask store managers which suppliers publish temperature and handling standards and favor those SKUS. Meanwhile, a private label with clear specs can be safer than a national logo with soft claims. Show me the paperwork. Even so, buying alone is expensive. Buying together rewrites the math. Start a neighborhood text thread to split butter and cheese from Costco. Organize a school parent bulk order for milk cartons at case rates. And swap freezer space for a friend's minivan so both households win. On the other hand, co-ops and farm shares spread volatility over seasons and give you first call on surplus cream, which stabilizes holidays before prices spike. Buy together, pay less. Meanwhile, menu design is your daily shield because waste is the silent tax on food inflation. Map a milk ladder across 5 days. Fresh glasses first, cooking second, baking third, and freeze the rest in ice cube trays for sauces and custards. Even so, cook once and use twice with mac and cheese, lasagna, or breakfast strata, freezing half labeled with date and unit cost so next week's dinner arrives prepaid. Plan saves protein. On the other hand, budget guardrails stop panic from driving the cart. Set a weekly dairy cap that fits the month, track unit prices in a notes app, and commit to a substitution matrix. Oil replaces butter in certain bakes, bechamel replaces half the cheese in others, and strained yogurt replaces sour cream outright. Meanwhile, when a product crosses your ceiling, you shift lanes automatically instead of arguing with the shelf tag. Numbers beat nerves. However, household playbooks work fastest when policy stops tripping them, and realistic fixes have names. Targeted tariff relief for audited dairy inputs. Fast-track inspections on low-risk plants, time-limited feed credits during climate shocks, and cold-chain energy rebates for small retailers all move the dial without breaking faith with domestic producers. Even so, transparency pays too. Quarterly lot-level recall dashboards from big brands would cut panic buying and smooth demand. Fix the levers. Fast. Even so, the end game isn't to moralize. It's to restore ritual without wrecking the budget. Breakfast should taste like calm, coffee should taste like you, and dessert should be a choice again, not a gamble. On the other hand, our two callbacks still whisper reminders. The McDonald's portion cut taught us that value claims can hide shrinkage, and the Aldi discount glow proved the cheapest line item can carry the highest risk without proof. As a consequence of this, keep the three motifs on the fridge: price versus plate, policy to pantry, proof over promises, and make home feel steady again. Make breakfast yours again.